The hook, the sound of cascading water drowned out Karen's screams as she stood ankle-deep in her flooded basement, staring up at the massive waterfall that now bordered her property. What started as a neighbor's petty complaint about pool noise had spiraled into something far more destructive than either of them could have imagined. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd wanted quiet, and now the roar of 10,000 gallons per minute would haunt her dreams forever. But this wasn't just about noise anymore. This was about the secret she'd buried in her backyard, the one now threatening to surface with every drop of diverted water. Some battles Karen was about to learn should never the first time Karen Whitmore heard the Delacroix family's pool pump kick on at 6:47 a.m., she was already awake, nursing her third cup of coffee and scrolling through neighborhood violation reports on her tablet. The mechanical hum drifted through her bedroom window like an unwelcome alarm clock, joining the symphony of suburban morning sounds she'd spent years cataloging in her complaint journal. She pressed her thin lips together and reached for her phone, fingers moving with practiced efficiency across the screen. The Riverside Homeowners Association app loaded instantly. She'd paid extra for premium internet specifically for moments like this. Noise ordinance violation, she muttered, typing rapidly, excessive mechanical noise before 7 a.m. Property 1247 Maple Ridge Drive. Karen had moved to the exclusive Riverside development 3 years ago, specifically for its promise of tranquility. The marketing brochures had featured words like serene, peaceful, and refined living. Nowhere had they mentioned that some residents would treat their backyards like personal water parks. The Delacroix family had moved in 6 months ago, a young couple with twin 8-year-old boys and apparently no understanding of proper suburban etiquette. Mark Delacroix was some kind of tech executive, always rushing off to work in expensive suits, while his wife Sophie seemed to spend her days orchestrating what Karen could only describe as aquatic chaos. The pool itself was an abomination. Not a modest rectangular installation like the subdivision covenants suggested, but an elaborate, kidney-shaped monstrosity with an attached spa, water slide, and enough pool equipment to service a resort. The pump system ran on a timer that seemed to have been programmed by someone with a complete disregard for civilized sleeping hours. Karen walked to her back window and peered through the privacy slats of her custom blinds. Sure enough, there was Sophie Delacroix, already in a swimsuit despite the early hour, skimming leaves from the pool's surface while her boys cannonballed into the deep end with abandon. The sound of their laughter grated against Karen's nerves. Like fingernails on a chalkboard, she'd filed 17 noise complaints in the past month. 17. The HOA had sent the standard warning letters, but nothing had changed. If anything, the Delacroix family seemed to be expanding their aquatic activities, adding pool parties that stretched well into the evening hours. Karen's phone buzzed with a text from her neighbor across the street. Elderly Mrs. Patterson. Karen, dear, are you filing another complaint about the pool? I have to say, those children sound like they're having such fun. She deleted the message without responding. Mrs. Patterson didn't understand. None of them did. This wasn't about children having fun. This was about property values, community standards, and the basic social contract that kept neighborhoods civilized. Her tablet chimed with a response from the HOA, Mrs. Whitmore. We've received your complaint. Please note that pool equipment operation between 7 a.m. and 9 p.m. is within acceptable parameters according to community guidelines. Karen's jaw tightened. She'd helped write those guidelines when she served on the Architectural Review Board. Clearly, they needed revision. She spent the next hour documenting everything: decibel readings taken with her phone app, time-stamped photos of the excessive water activity, and a detailed log of noise violations. Her evidence was meticulous, irrefutable. At 8:30 a.m., she marched across the street. The Delacroix house was a sprawling colonial with pristine landscaping and a 3-car garage. Karen had done her research mark, worked for a cybersecurity firm, and pulled in a 7-figure salary, while Sophie had been some kind of marketing executive before the twins were born. New money, Karen had concluded, the kind of people who bought their way into exclusive neighborhoods without understanding the unwritten rules. She rang the doorbell, waiting with the patience of someone accustomed to making uncomfortable conversations. Sophie answered the door in a colorful cover-up, her dark hair still damp from the pool. She was younger than Karen by at least 15 years. with a kind of effortless beauty that came from good genes and expensive skincare routines. "Oh, hi, Karen," Sophie said, her smile faltering slightly. "How can I help you?" "We need to talk about your pool situation," Karen said, dispensing with pleasantries. "The noise is becoming unacceptable." Sophie's eyebrows rose. "I'm sorry, what?" "Noise. The pump system. It starts running before 7 a.m., which violates community quiet hours." "And the children," Karen gestured toward the backyard where the sound of splashing continued unabated. "The screaming and shouting is disruptive to the entire neighborhood." "They're just playing," Sophie said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "It's summer. Kids play in pools during the summer." "There are appropriate times for recreational activities," Karen replied, "and appropriate volume levels. I've been documenting noise violations for the past month, and I'm prepared to take this to the county if necessary." Sophie stared at her for a long moment. "Are you serious right now? You want to call the county because children are playing in their own backyard?" "I want you to be a considerate neighbor," Karen said. "This is a family community, but that doesn't mean we abandon all standards of civility." "Standards of civility." Sophie's voice rose slightly. "Karen, they're 8 years old. They laugh when they're happy. The pool pump runs for 2 hours in the morning to keep the water clean. We're not operating a nightclub here." "The noise ordinance clearly states—" "I don't care what the noise ordinance states," Sophie interrupted, her composure finally cracking. "My children live here. This is their home. They have every right to enjoy their backyard without being policed by someone who apparently has nothing better to do than measure sound levels." Karen felt her chest tighten with indignation. "I have every right to peaceful enjoyment of my property. Your pool is affecting my quality of life. Then maybe you should consider moving somewhere more suited to your ... preferences," Sophie said, her tone icy. "Perhaps a retirement community where children aren't allowed." The insult hung in the air between them like a thrown gauntlet. Karen's hands clenched at her sides. "I was here first," she said quietly. "I chose this neighborhood specifically because it promised a certain standard of living. You moved in and decided those standards didn't apply to you." "Those standards don't include silencing children who are playing in their own yard," Sophie shot back. "I'm sorry if their happiness is inconvenient for you, but I'm not going to tell my kids they can't swim because their laughter is too loud." Took a step closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Then perhaps you should have thought about that before you installed a pool the size of a small lake in a suburban neighborhood." Sophie's eyes flashed. "You know what? I think we're done here. If you have a problem with our pool, take it up with the HOA. They've already told you we're within our rights." She started to close the door, but Karen pressed her palm against her. This isn't over," Karen said. "There are ways to handle neighbors who won't listen to reason." Sophie pushed the door firmly shut, leaving Karen standing alone on the porch as she walked back to her house. Karen could hear the twins' voices calling to their mother. "Mom, who was that lady? Why did she look so mad?" Sophie's response carried clearly across the morning air. "Just someone who forgot how to be happy, sweethearts. Don't worry about it." Karen's face burned with humiliation. She stood in her driveway for a moment, listening to the sound of renewed splashing and laughter from the Delacroix backyard. Forgot how to be happy, as if happiness justified disturbing an entire neighborhood. Back in her house, Karen opened her laptop and began typing with furious precision. If the HOA wouldn't handle this situation, she'd find someone who would. The county had noise ordinance enforcement officers. The state had environmental regulations about pool runoff. The city had zoning compliance inspectors. One way or another, she was going to teach the Delacroix family about being considerate neighbors. She started with the county environmental office, filing a complaint about potential water waste and improper drainage. Then she contacted the city planning department about possible zoning violations regarding pool size and setback requirements. Finally, she reached out to a lawyer who specialized in neighbor disputes. By noon, she had initiated 3 separate official investigations and scheduled a consultation for a potential civil lawsuit. Karen made herself a sandwich and ate it while standing at her kitchen window, watching Sophie and the twins play Marco Polo in their pool. The pump hummed steadily in the background, a mechanical drone that seemed to mock her with every revolution. Video, making sure to capture the audio levels, evides. Part 2, ESCALTIO, The county environmental inspector arrived at 7:30 a.m. on a Tuesday, driving a white pickup truck with official seals that caught the attention of every neighbor on Maple Ridge Drive. Karen watched from her living room window as Gerald Hutchins, a thin man in his 50s with a clipboard and measuring tape, parked directly in front of the Delacroix house. She'd timed this perfectly. Mark would already be at work, leaving Sophie to handle the inspection alone. Karen had learned, through careful observation, that Sophie was less composed when dealing with official matters without her husband's support. Karen slipped out her back door and positioned herself near the property line, pretending to tend her meticulously maintained rose garden while eavesdropping on the conversation next door. "Mrs. Delacroix," Hutchins called out, rapping on the front door. "I'm with the County Environmental Compliance Office. We received a complaint about potential water drainage issues on your property." Sophie appeared in the doorway wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked confused and slightly panicked. "I'm sorry, what kind of complaint?" "Concerns about pool water runoff affecting the neighborhood drainage system," Hutchins read from his clipboard. "I need to inspect your pool equipment and drainage setup." Karen pruned her roses with unnecessary vigor, straining to hear every word. Okay," Sophie said. "Can I call my husband first, ma'am? This is a routine inspection. Won't take long, but it needs to be done today." Sophie reluctantly led Hutchins around to the backyard, where Karen could see them through the gaps in her privacy fence. The inspector immediately focused on the pool equipment, taking measurements and photos of the pump housing, filtration system, and drainage pipes. "This concrete pad," Hutchins said, kneeling next to the pump housing. "When was this installed?" "About 6 months ago when we moved in," Sophie replied. "The previous owners had the pool, but we upgraded the equipment." "Did you get permits for the equipment upgrade?" Karen saw Sophie's face go pale. I think so. My husband handled all of that." Hutchins made notes on his clipboard. "I'll need to verify that with the permit office. This pad appears to be within the drainage easement, which would require special approval." "What does that mean?" Sophie asked, her voice tight with worry. "Could mean you'll need to relocate the equipment or face potential fines," Hutchins said. "Matter-of-factly, I'll have my report ready by Friday." Karen smiled as she watched the inspector take more photos and measurements. This was exactly what she'd hoped, for a clear violation that would force the Delacroix family to either move their noisy equipment or pay substantial penalties. After Hutchins left, Karen waited exactly 20 minutes before walking over to Sophie's front door. She found her neighbor sitting on the porch steps, phone pressed to her ear, clearly distressed. "Mark, they're saying we might have to move the entire pump system," Sophie was saying. "The inspector thinks it's in some kind of easement." "No, I don't know what that means either." Karen cleared her throat. Sophie looked up, her eyes red-rimmed with stress. "I'll call you back," Sophie said into the phone, then stood to face Karen. "What do you want?" "I heard there was an inspector here," Karen said with feigned concern. "I hope everything's all right." Sophie stared at her for a long moment. "You called them, didn't you?" "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Cut the act, Karen. You've been harassing us for weeks, and now suddenly there's a county inspector asking about permits we supposedly don't have." Karen maintained her innocent expression. "I'm simply concerned about property values in the neighborhood. If there are permit issues, it affects all of us." "Property values," Sophie's voice rose. "You're trying to force us to spend thousands of dollars moving our pool equipment because you don't like the sound of children playing." "I'm trying to ensure that everyone follows the same rules," Karen replied calmly. "If you'd been more reasonable about the noise issues, none of this would have been necessary." Sophie stepped closer, her hands clenched into fists. "You vindictive, miserable, careful," Karen interrupted. "We wouldn't want to add disturbing the peace to your list of violations." For a moment, Karen thought Sophie might actually hit her. The younger woman's face was flushed with anger, her breathing rapid and shallow. But then Sophie seemed to collect herself, taking a step back. "You know what? Fine. You want to play games? We can play games." "I'm not sure what you mean," Karen said. "You will," Sophie said, then walked back into her house and slammed the door. Karen felt a flutter of unease at the threat, but pushed it aside. Sophie was upset, lashing out like a cornered animal. Once the county finished their investigation and the Delacroix family faced the reality of expensive compliance measures, they'd be much more cooperative about noise levels. 3 days later, Karen was awakened at 5:30 a.m. by the sound of construction equipment. She stumbled to her bedroom window and pulled back the curtains to see a massive excavator parked in the Delacroix backyard, its diesel engine rumbling as it positioned itself. Near the pool equipment, a crew of workers in hard hats were setting up what appeared to be a major construction project. Karen grabbed her phone and speed-dialed the HOA emergency line. "This is Karen Whitmore at 1251 Maple Ridge Drive," she said when someone answered. "My neighbors are conducting unauthorized construction work before 6 a.m. This is a clear violation of community noise ordinances. I'll send someone out to investigate," the voice replied. "Can you describe the nature of the work? They have heavy machinery operating in their backyard. It's completely inappropriate for a residential neighborhood." Karen threw on a robe and hurried outside, where she found several other neighbors already gathered on the sidewalk, drawn by the unusual activity. "What's going on over there?" asked Mr. Peterson from 2 houses down. "Construction work," Karen said grimly, starting at dawn, apparently. Mrs. Patterson shuffled over from across the street, wearing a quilted housecoat and slippers. "Oh my, that's quite a production. What are they building?" Before Karen could answer, Sophie appeared at the Delacroix front door, fully dressed and looking remarkably composed for someone supposedly conducting emergency construction work. "Good morning, everyone," Sophie called out cheerfully. "Sorry about the early start, but we're on a tight deadline." Karen marched across the street. "This is completely unacceptable. Construction work doesn't begin until 7 a.m. at the earliest." "Actually," Sophie said, pulling out a folded paper from her pocket, "emergency infrastructure work can begin as early as 5 a.m. with proper permits, which we have." She handed Karen the document. It was, indeed, an official county permit for emergency relocation of pool equipment due to environmental compliance requirements. Emergency. Karen scanned the permit details. "This is hardly an emergency. The county inspector classified it as emergency work," Sophie explained to the gathered neighbors. "Apparently, our pool equipment was installed in a drainage easement, which could affect the entire neighborhood's water management system. We have to move it immediately to prevent potential flooding issues." Karen felt her stomach drop. This wasn't how it was supposed to work. The Delacroix family was supposed to be penalized, not given emergency permits to expand their construction activities. "Where exactly are you moving the equipment?" Karen asked. Sophie smiled, but her eyes were cold. "We're relocating everything to the back corner of our property. It'll be much more efficient there." "The back corner?" Karen's voice cracked slightly. "That's directly adjacent to my bedroom window." "Yes, I know," Sophie said, "but it's the only location that meets the county's setback requirements. The permit specifically designates that area as the approved site." Karen stared at the permit, reading the technical specifications with growing horror. The new location would put the pump equipment less than 15 feet from her house, close enough that she'd hear every mechanical vibration, every cycling of the filtration system. "This is intentional," Karen whispered. "You're doing this to get back at me." "I'm doing this to comply with county regulations," Sophie replied. "The same regulations you insisted we follow." The excavator's engine revved, and the operator began digging a new concrete pad exactly where Sophie had indicated. The noise was tremendous. Echoing off the houses and rattling windows, Karen watched in dismay as the morning's work progressed. The construction crew was clearly professional, working with the kind of efficiency that suggested they'd been well paid to prioritize speed. By noon, they'd not only excavated the new site, but had also begun installing a much larger pump system. "Then the original, what is that?" Karen demanded, pointing at the massive new equipment being lowered into place. "Upgraded filtration system," Sophie explained. "The county inspector recommended it to handle the increased water circulation needed. For proper drainage, it's more powerful than our old system, but much more environmentally compliant." More powerful meant louder. Karen could see the specifications printed on the side of the new pump, housing a commercial-grade system designed for resort pools, capable of moving thousands of gallons per hour. "This is insane," Karen said. "You're installing industrial equipment." "In a residential neighborhood, it's approved equipment," Sophie corrected. "Everything we're doing has been reviewed and permitted by the appropriate authorities." As if to emphasize. Part 3. The Waterfall, the sound began at dawn on Monday morning, not the gentle babble of a mountain stream, but the thunderous roar of industrial-grade water pumps forcing thousands of gallons over manufactured stone. Karen jolted awake in her bed, heart pounding, as the cascade of water seemed to shake the very foundations of her house. She stumbled to her bedroom window and pulled back, the curtains to witness her nightmare made manifest. Water poured down over carefully arranged boulders in sheets, so thick they created their own weather system, sending clouds of mist drifting across both properties. The sound was indescribable, part Niagara Falls, part industrial accident, but had to step into her walk-in closet to hear the person. On the other end, "You have to do something," she shouted into the phone. "They've installed a waterfall that's destroying the entire neighborhood's peace." "Ma'am, I can barely hear you," the voice replied. "Can you speak up?" "I am speaking up. The noise is so loud I can't even hear myself think." Karen ended the call. In frustration, and threw on clothes, determined to confront Sophie directly. She marched across the street and pounded on the Delacroix front door, but had to wait nearly 5 minutes before anyone answered. Mark Delacroix opened the door, looking surprisingly well-rested for someone whose house was adjacent to a man-made waterfall. He was already dressed for work in an expensive suit, coffee mug in hand. "Karen," he said, his voice barely audible over the water's roar. "I wondered when you'd come by." "You have to shut that thing off," Karen said, pointing toward the backyard. "It's a noise violation of epic proportions." Mark stepped outside and closed the door behind him, forcing Karen to move closer to hear him speak. "Actually, it's not," he said calmly. "Water features are specifically exempted from noise ordinances as natural sound sources. I had our lawyer verify that before we began construction." Natural sound sources. Karen's voice cracked with disbelief. "There's nothing natural about that monstrosity. The county environmental office classified it as a natural drainage enhancement," Mark explained. "Waterfalls are considered beneficial for local ecosystems. In fact, we received a tax credit for installing it." Karen felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. "A tax credit. Environmental improvement incentive," Mark said. "The county is very supportive of residents who invest in sustainable water management systems. This isn't about water management," Karen said. "This is revenge. Your wife admitted as much." Mark's expression hardened. "My wife has been remarkably patient with your harassment campaign, filing false complaints, demanding inspections, trying to have our equipment removed. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences?" "False complaints?" Karen sputtered. "Your pool equipment was illegally installed." "No, it was installed by the previous owners without proper permits," Mark corrected. "We've now brought everything into full compliance at considerable expense. The waterfall is simply an added benefit of the required drainage improvements." Karen looked past him toward the backyard, where the waterfall continued its relentless cascade. Through the mist, she could see Sophie and the twins eating breakfast on their patio, apparently unbothered by the noise. "How can you even live with that sound?" Karen asked. "You get used to it," Mark said with a slight smile. "The boys love it. They pretend they're camping by a river." "I'll file a complaint with the county," Karen threatened. "Feel free," Mark replied. "But you should know that we're planning additional water features." Sophie's been researching feng shui principles for optimal water flow. She's thinking about adding a second waterfall on the other side of the pool. Karen's vision blurred. "Second waterfall. Maybe a third," Mark said thoughtfully. "The tax incentives are quite generous for environmental improvements." He turned to go back inside, then paused. "Oh, and Karen, you might want to invest in some good earplugs. We're planning to upgrade the pump system next month to increase the water flow. The contractor thinks we can get up to 15,000 gallons per hour." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Karen alone with the thunderous sound of her own defeat. She walked back to her house in a daze, the waterfall's roar following her like an accusation. Inside, she found that the noise penetrated every room, every corner, every moment of silence she'd once treasured. Karen spent the next 3 hours on the phone with various county offices, trying to find someone who could help. The noise control office said water features were exempt from sound ordinances. The environmental office said the waterfall was a beneficial improvement. The planning department said all permits were in order, by noon. She'd exhausted every official channel and was left with only one option: her lawyer, Janet. Hoffman's office was located in a gleaming downtown tower, far enough from Maple Ridge Drive that the waterfall sound was just a memory. Karen sat across from the middle-aged attorney, describing her situation with growing desperation. "So let me understand this correctly," Hoffman said, reviewing the file Karen had brought. "You filed complaints about pool noise, which led to required equipment relocation, which resulted in the installation of a much louder waterfall system." "That's right," Karen confirmed, "and they're threatening to add more waterfalls." Hoffman leaned back in her leather chair. "Mrs. Whitmore, I have to ask, what exactly were you hoping to accomplish with the original complaints?" "I wanted them to be more considerate about noise levels," Karen said. "I thought if they faced some official scrutiny, they'd be more willing to compromise. And instead, you've given them legal justification to install industrial-grade water features in their backyard." Karen felt her cheeks burning. "I didn't know this would happen. The problem is that every action you've taken has been technically legal, but strategically disastrous," Hoffman explained. "You've created a paper trail that shows you as the aggressor in a neighbor dispute. Now they're responding with legally compliant but maximum impact countermeasures. So what are my options?" Hoffman was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents. "Honestly, very limited. They have all the proper permits, the tax incentives support their position, and they can argue that every improvement was necessitated by your complaints." "There has to be something," Karen pleaded. "We could try to argue that the waterfall constitutes a nuisance despite being technically legal," Hoffman said, "but that would require proving that the noise substantially interferes with your use and enjoyment of your property." "It does. I can't sleep, I can't relax, I can't even think clearly." "The problem is that nuisance law requires balancing competing interests," Hoffman explained. "Their water feature serves legitimate environmental purposes and increases their property value. Your complaint is essentially that you don't like the sound." Karen slumped in her chair. "So I'm just supposed to live with it?" "There is one other option," Hoffman said carefully, "but it's aggressive." "What kind of option?" "Property damage claims. If you can demonstrate that the waterfall is causing actual damage to your properties, structural damage, flooding, decreased property values, you might have grounds for a lawsuit." Karen's eyes brightened. "Structural damage. The vibrations from that much water flow could potentially affect your foundation over time," Hoffman explained. "And if the mist is causing moisture problems, that could lead to mold or other issues." "How would I prove that?" "You'd need structural engineers, environmental assessments, property appraisals. It would be expensive and time-consuming, with no guarantee of success." Karen thought about her savings account, her retirement funds, the quiet life she'd planned. How expensive? $50,000 to $100,000, minimum. Maybe more if it goes to trial. The number hit Karen like a physical blow. Her entire retirement nest egg, spent on a war she'd started by accident. "Is there any other way?" she asked. Hoffman studied her for a moment. "You could try talking to them directly. Apologize for the complaints. See if you can work out some kind of compromise. Apologize." The word tasted bitter in Karen's mouth. "Sometimes the best strategy is acknowledging when you've made a mistake," Hoffman said. "They might be willing to negotiate if you approach them differently." Karen left the lawyer's office feeling hollow and defeated. The drive home seemed to take forever, but she could hear the waterfalls roar from 3 blocks away. As she pulled into her driveway, she saw that a news van was parked on the street. A young reporter with perfectly styled hair was standing in front of the Delacroix house, speaking into a microphone while the waterfall thundered in the background. "This is Rebecca Martinez reporting from Maple Ridge Drive, where a neighbor dispute has resulted in what residents are calling the loudest backyard water feature in county history." Karen parked her car and walked over, drawn by morbid curiosity. The 12-foot waterfall was installed as part of an environmental compliance project, the reporter continued, but neighbors say the noise is disrupting the entire community. The camera operator panned to show the waterfall, then focused on several neighbors who had gathered to watch the news coverage. Karen recognized most of them people she'd lived near for years, but rarely sp. Part 4. The Suriand, Tarkaran, hadn't slept in 3 days. The waterfall's relentless cascade had become a form of acoustic torture. penetrating her dreams and jolting her awake every time she managed to drift off. She'd tried earplugs, white noise, machines, even sleeping pills, but nothing could block out the thunderous reminder of her spectacular miscalculation by Thursday morning. Her hands were shaking from exhaustion and caffeine overload. She stood at her kitchen window, watching. Sophie examined what appeared to be construction blueprints spread across the patio table. The plans were large enough that Karen could make out elevation drawings and what looked like plumbing schematics. The second waterfall was real, Sophie wasn't bluffing. Karen's phone buzzed with a text from her neighbor across the street. "Karen, we need to talk. The HOA is calling an emergency meeting about the noise situation. Tonight, at 7 p.m., her stomach clenched. An emergency HOA meeting meant the situation had escalated beyond individual complaints. The entire neighborhood was mobilizing, and Karen knew she'd be cast as the villain who had caused the crisis. She spent the morning researching property values in quieter neighborhoods, but every real estate website confirmed her worst fears. Her house's value had already begun declining due to the noise issues documented in public records. The news coverage hadn't helped. Potential buyers could simply Google her address and find video footage of the industrial waterfall next door. At noon, Karen made a decision that felt like swallowing broken glass. She walked across the street and rang the Delacroix doorbell. Sophie answered almost immediately, as if she'd been expecting this moment. She was wearing a flowing sundress and looked remarkably serene for someone living next to a man-made Niagara Falls. "Karen," Sophie said, her voice neutral. "How can I help you?" "I need to talk to you," Karen said, having to raise her voice to be heard over the water's roar. "About the situation?" Sophie studied her for a moment, then stepped outside and gestured toward the front porch, where they could speak more easily. "What kind of talk?" Sophie asked. Karen took a deep breath, tasting the humiliation before she spoke the words. "I want to apologize for the complaints, the inspections, all of it. I was wrong." Sophie's eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression remained guarded. "Wrong about what, specifically? Wrong to file complaints about your pool? Wrong to call the county? Wrong to try to force you to change your lifestyle?" Each word felt like acid in Karen's throat. "I was being a bad neighbor, and I'm sorry." "See," Sophie said, "and what exactly are you hoping this apology will accomplish?" The question caught Karen off guard. She'd expected anger, satisfaction, maybe even gloating. She hadn't expected Sophie to analyze her motivations so clinically. "I'm hoping we can work out some kind of compromise," Karen admitted. "About the waterfowl? What kind of compromise?" "Maybe you could run it during daytime hours only, or reduce the water flow." Karen's voice cracked with desperation. "I can't sleep, Sophie. I can't think. I can't live like this." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, watching Karen with an unreadable expression. "Do you remember what you said to me that first morning when I told you my children were just playing?" Karen's mind raced back to their initial confrontation. "I know, not exactly. You said there were appropriate times for recreational activities and appropriate volume levels." Sophie recited with perfect accuracy. "You said I needed to be a considerate neighbor." "Yes, but you also said this wasn't over, that there were ways to handle neighbors who wouldn't listen to reason." Sophie's voice remained calm, but her eyes had gone cold. "Do you remember?" That Karen felt a chill run down her spine. "I was angry. I didn't mean you meant every word," Sophie interrupted, "and you followed through on every threat. Multiple government agencies, potential lawsuits, harassment campaigns designed to force us out of our own home." "I never tried to force you out," Karen protested. "Didn't you?" Sophie pulled out her phone and scrolled through what appeared to be a long list of documents. 17 noise complaints in 30 days. Environmental violations that cost us $12,000 to remediate. Permit challenges that required legal representation. A surveyor to verify property lines. Engineers to assess structural compliance. Karen watched in growing horror as Sophie continued reading. 3 different county departments investigating our property. A lawyer threatening civil action. Media attention that exposed our children to public scrutiny. Sophie looked up from her phone. "What would you call that, if not a campaign to force us out?" "I just wanted some peace and quiet," Karen whispered. "No," Sophie said firmly. "You wanted control. You wanted us to modify our lives to suit your preferences, and when we wouldn't comply, you declared war. The accusation hung in the air between them, made more devastating by its accuracy. So what happens now? Karen asked. Sophie stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, where the waterfall's mist created tiny rainbows in the afternoon sunlight. Now you live with the consequences of your choices. You're not going to compromise at all. Why should I? Sophie turned back to face Karen. You've demonstrated that any sign of weakness will be exploited. Any accommodation will be seen as validation for future demands. I'm not making demands, Karen said. I'm asking for mercy. Mercy, Sophie repeated thoughtfully. That's interesting. Where was mercy when you were trying to destroy our lives? Karen felt tears building behind her eyes. I made a mistake. I'm sorry. What more can I do? Nothing, Sophie said simply. There's nothing you can do to undo what you've started. Please, Karen begged. I'll do anything. I'll sign something promising never to file another complaint. I'll pay for whatever modifications you need to reduce the noise. Sophie shook her head. You still don't understand. This isn't about money or promises. This is about consequences. What consequences? The consequence of learning that actions have impacts beyond what you intended, Sophie explained. The consequence of discovering that other people have the same rights you claimed for yourself. Karen stared at her, recognizing the futility of her position. So the waterfall stays, Sophie confirmed. And the second one will be installed next month. How many waterfalls are you planning? Sophie smiled, but there was no warmth in it. As many as it takes. Takes for what? For you to truly understand what you've done. Karen walked back to her house feeling more defeated than she'd ever felt. In her life, the HOA meeting was still hours away, but she already knew how it would go. The neighbors would demand action. The board would investigate options. And ultimately, they'd discover what Karen already knew. The Delacroix family held all the legal cards. She spent the afternoon drafting a letter to Sophie, offering to sell her house to them at below market value if they'd agree to modify the waterfall. But before she could finish writing it, her doorbell rang. Karen opened the door to find Mark Delacroix standing on her porch, still in his work clothes, looking tired but determined. We need to talk, he said. Sophie already made your position clear, Karen replied. Sophie doesn't know I'm here, Mark said. Can I come in? Karen hesitated, then stepped aside to let him enter. The waterfall's noise was slightly muted inside her house, but still omnipresent. Mark looked around her living room, taking in the tidy furniture, the family photos, the carefully maintained order that had once been Karen's pride. Nice place, he said. What do you want, Mark? He sat down on her sofa without being invited. I want to explain something to you about my wife. Karen remained standing, arms crossed defensively. Sophie grew up in a house where her father controlled everything, Mark began. What time she got up, what she wore, who she could talk to, when she could leave her room. He justified it all as maintaining family order and community standards. Karen felt a sick recognition building in her stomach. She spent her childhood walking on eggshells, trying not to upset the man who held absolute power over her environment, Mark continued. When we moved here, she thought she'd finally found a place where her children could just be children. I wasn't trying to control her children, Karen protested. Weren't you? Mark asked. 17 complaints about the sound of children playing, documentation of their laughter levels, photographs of their recreational activities. Karen sank into a chair, the parallels hitting her like physical blows. When you started filing complaints, it triggered something in Sophie, Mark explained. All those old feelings of being controlled, monitored, judged for living her life. I didn't know, Karen whispered. No, you didn't, Mark agreed. But that doesn't change what happened. You became the authority figure trying to limit her family's freedom, and she responded the only way she knew how, by fighting back, by refusing to be controlled ever again, Mark corrected. The waterfall isn't really about revenge, Karen. It's about establishing that no one gets to dictate how we live in our own home. Karen looked at him through her exhaustion. So, what are you telling me? I'm telling you that Sophie will never back down, not because she's cruel, but because she can't. Backing down feels like surrender to the kind of control she spent years escaping. Then why are you here? Mark was quiet for a moment, and Karen could see him wrestling with something. Because I have children, he said finally. And those children are going to grow up next door to you. They've